I'm Shubha Das. I'm Associate Director at Curve Theatre in Leicester. I'm also a freelance director and producer through my own company, Shubha Das Company.
And you're born in the UK?
I was, yes. Born just outside Newcastle in 1984, so you can add up how old that makes me now.
So does your family come from Newcastle?
No, well, my family moved over from northeast India in the 70s. Well, my dad came over in the early 70s and my mum came over 10 years later, once my father was able to kind of get all the passports and things that he needed to bring the family over with British citizenship. And then my twin brother and I were born over here. And my big brother and sister were born in India. Kind of, my dad was coming backwards and forwards and doing trips and things. So they've got a very interesting perspective. Whereas for me and my twin Deba, we, you know, the context of our upbringing was very much being one of only two Asian families within a small village, kind of an estate. Outside of Whitley Bay, which is outside of Newcastle.
And so you're Bengali?
Yes, yes. So on my mum's side, yes, and my dad's family were just outside of Calcutta, and my mum's family had moved over into India from what is now Bangladesh during that period of time.
So do you speak any Indian dialects?
I don't, actually, and that's interesting. It's something that I've thought about much more in the past few years than I did as a child. And my father actually passed away when I was 10, so I'm not able to have a conversation with him about it. But the pressure on me and my twin, when we, through our upbringing and through our father's influence, was that he was very keen and committed to the idea of us being brought up, kind of not in an English way. That sounds that's not right. It's sort of, he wanted us to do the best we could within the system we found ourselves in, essentially. So his focus was on education, and because, you know, we were ultimately quite a poor family, and it was, you know, it was a council estate that we were growing up in, and my dad worked incredibly hard, and his priority was that my twin and I would read a lot and use kind of intelligence as our way out of a tough background, which I think we've both managed to do. So there's that's a real victory there in those terms. But he really marked a separation. So to the extent that we didn't go back, we didn't visit. He had a network of friends, also from India, and a community around him, and he was a very popular person. But he was really interested in a way, and I say it would be interesting to talk to him about that, which I won't be able to do. But perhaps one day to try and track down some of his elder friends and see what their perspective was on why he was so determined to kind of draw a line. And I wonder what there was in his background that he was perhaps trying to get away from. I don't know. Kind of as a theatre maker now, these stories and these ideas are very interesting to me. And in a way, I guess I've not been brave enough yet to start asking the right questions of the people who are around. It's part of me that wonders, this is where I really hope that my mum doesn't ever sit down and watch this. You know, there's this 10-year period of my dad's life when he was here, and kind of going backwards and forwards, and my big brother and big sister were born over there, that we know very little about. And it feels like there's a mystery there. I don't know.
So you went to study law, but how did you gravitate into theatre?
Well, I was, and you know, and it comes down to when my father passed away as well. He, at the point where he passed away, he'd been looking into things like scholarships for my twin and I at the various good schools in the northeast. And at that point, we were at the local state school, just over the road from where we lived, and fortunate to have extraordinary teachers who, after our dad passed away, sort of said, well, we'll help you, we'll try and help you get into a good school. And these were teachers who, of their own accord, were staying behind late to kind of coach my twin and I on exam technique and things like that. And my twin and I sat these exams and got into the Newcastle Royal Grammar School, which is a fee-paying school. There was a huge culture there of drama, and I was very lucky in that environment to have the head of drama, Mr. Thomas, who was very committed to the idea of students creating their own work. So from the age of about 13, we were not only doing shows that the school was putting on, but he was kind of encouraging students to manage their own projects, create their own projects, and resourcing that as well. And I was, as I say, incredibly lucky to go to a school where that was possible, you know, and I kind of look back on it now, and certainly in my role here where I support a lot of young artists and developing talent in Leicester, you kind of go, wow, that's actually quite a lot of organisational effort and quite a lot of investment that's been put in, and I took that for granted in a way. So I was always making theatre from a very early age. But actually, in all fairness, that culture went back to even before I was at that very good school. One of my earliest memories was when I was about 10, and the state school that I was at, the middle school, the head of music, Mrs. Gregg, had encouraged students to try and put together their own musical. And again, this real, you know, I think there is this thing about who our teachers are and having those people that are those inspirations and opening up those resources. So I was very lucky to receive all of that. At the point where I decided what I wanted to do at university and what I wanted to do with my life, you know, my twin wanted to read law at Cambridge. A lot of my friends were, and it sort of seemed like a very sensible career path, but with that pressure of kind of, you know, growing up in circumstances where, you know, where we couldn't ever afford to go on school trips and where we didn't ever go on holiday. And you didn't notice that because actually young people are very resilient, and it was fine, you know, we had lots of fun and we had a very happy childhood. But there was that sense that there was more possible. And as I got into Cambridge to read law, and I guess I found it boring, in all fairness. And I kind of thought, if I'm going to do this much reading, I want to read stuff that's a little bit more interesting. So I switched to English, and they were very kind and allowed me to do that. And the intention was always that I would do a law conversion course at the end of that. And again, you don't realise it at the time, you don't realise how spoilt you are, because it's just what's happening. And so at Cambridge, a lot of the law firms kind of pursue law students, and so even though I'd switched to another subject, I was still getting letters, and law firms were paying for all of my textbooks and things like that because they hoped that I would choose to be a lawyer for them kind of after I graduated. And I ignored all of that, because by that point I'd started directing properly at university, and just realised, and it's a very selfish thing in a way, it's that thing of, you know, getting out of bed in the morning and having something that really excites you, it makes you leap up and go, yes, I'm going to do this today. And I recurrently had that sensation making my own work, and I thought, okay, well, I want to take this further, you know, and had a very strange experience where I went to the careers service at Cambridge University, which you would hope would be a repository of information on making a career as a director, and was told by two very nice ladies that if I wanted to be a director, I would need to move to London, write some letters to directors whose work I admired, and you know, if they were Cambridge graduates as well, that might be helpful, and ask if I could observe their work in rehearsals and do that, and that occasionally I might be asked what my opinion was. And if I got that right, they might employ me as an assistant director. And then after a while, I might be allowed to direct my own shows. But of course, you know, nobody would pay me for being an observer, or maybe not even for being an assistant. So I'd need somewhere to live in London that was rent-free and things like that. And I guess if I'd been a more naive person, and if the internet wasn't the extraordinary resource it is, I would have taken that on board and just stopped there, because that is impossible. That set of barriers means that nobody from any kind of impoverished background is ever going to access creating theatre in this country. And I refused to believe that. And I did some Googling, did some research. the Stage, the industry newspaper at that point, and still does, had a forum, an online forum about training where people could ask questions. And I just logged in and I said, you know, I'm at Cambridge and I think I've got the potential to be a good director. I'm doing some exciting work here. I want to take it further. Has anybody got any idea on what I can practically do, given the kind of background I come from? And yet another bit of luck. A chap who was the outgoing president of Equity replied and said that there's this course that's been set up, the Birkbeck Masters in Theatre Directing, kind of funded by the Arts Council, and he thought that I sounded like a good match for that course and that I should try and find out more about it. And so I did, and kind of did the interviews and was offered a place on this course. And was kind of one of the youngest people that had done the course at that point, and I kind of went in for my interview, I remember this kind of shamelessly sort of saying, and they said to me, you know, this course is designed for people who are properly committing to this as a career, and, you know, you're very young, and does that mean it's right for you? And I sort of said really straightforward, I don't have any backup options. There is no limit to how seriously I take this and how much this matters to me and how much I think it's something that I can do and offer something to and contribute something to. So they gave me a place on the course. But even then, I mean, it was a university, statutory university, so the fees weren't that expensive. But I still had the issue of that I was going to have to go and live in London and do all these sorts of things. And I managed to, by basically filling in this most deceitful application in the world, get a career development loan. I took a weekend job as well, so I was working 7 days a week for kind of 2 years. And also, and this is where the whole Oxbridge thing comes into its own, my college, Clare College, wrote me essentially a blank cheque for my training, asking me what I felt the shortfall was and that they would support it. And I'm paying them back very slowly. And, you know, if I ever get that big West End hit, I'll pay them off very quickly. So that entire story tells you a lot about luck and bloody-mindedness and the financial expense. And, you know, I only finished paying off my career development loan about a year ago, and all of these things. And yeah, it's hard. As much as I had those hardships, I was lucky to be in certain contexts that enabled me to access forms of support that I think other people don't necessarily access. And that's been my journey. And then I had the master stroke of fortune to finish my training on the Birkbeck course, spending a year as a resident director at Theatre Royal Stratford East, which was incredibly formative, as it felt like a real homecoming. It felt like I'd come from quite a working class, tough background, skipped away to Cambridge for a few years, and then at Stratford East found a space where I felt like I was pulling those strands together and seeing and really getting a really practical understanding of this thing that had always been bubbling away in the back of my head, which is about who creates work, who tells stories, why do they tell stories, and what is that space where people come together. And obviously that theatre remains kind of in the great tradition of Joan Littlewood, kind of fully committed to exploring that. And that kind of started to give me an idea of what my working practice was. And I directed a show there, which was a production of Medea, because on the Birkbeck course, we all got a little bit of funding to do our first professional show, which again is amazing. Looking back on it, absolutely amazing. Golden days for the arts they were. And that was a really complicated negotiation with the team at Stratford East, because they hadn't staged any classical work for many, many years. And I think there was a real anxiety that I was wanting to do something really kind of bourgeois and academic and elitist and Cambridgey. And I'm sure they thought that that's exactly who I was, that I was sort of the Cambridgey boy. For me, that story felt really important. And this was, what, 2008? 8 that I was doing this there, because obviously it was not that far after 7/7, and was it 2009? And it was, you know, a period of time where there was this really powerful thing being spoken about, or I felt not being spoken about, which is people saying, well, how can people do this? You know, these savages, these monsters blowing people up on the tube. And the thing about Medea as a kind of archetypal story is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a woman who is an outsider, a foreigner, a migrant, and she's told she's worthless, she's savage, she's different, she's an alien. And is it surprising that under that pressure, somebody then does something that is horrific, that they feel so disconnected socially, so disenfranchised socially, that they then do something of extraordinary social rupture? And that mattered to me, telling that story in a very idealistic, young sort of way. And it wasn't something that I was really able to consciously articulate at the time. I just knew that I wanted to do this show. And I knew that I wanted to work with the idea of turning the space into something unusual. So we kind of dropped to the iron on the main stage at Stratford East, flooded the entire thing with like sand and rubbish, and the audience came in through the dock doors as if they were entering these kind of huge doors, this kind of no man's land, this liminal world out on the edges. And it was actually an all-black cast that I worked with on the show, and not in a kind of crass way, I hope. They were the 3 actors that I met who I thought were extraordinary. And part of that was working with a woman called Eno Saucy, a Ghanaian storyteller, and she'd sort of worked with Peter Brook in the 70s and things like that, and just irradiated this exceptional kind of warmth and generosity. And I knew I wanted that for my chorus. I could only afford 3 actors, so I thought, okay, well, if she's the centre of this, who do we put around her, and all this. And then, because he was working there at the time, brought in Kenrick Sandy, who runs Boy Blue Entertainment, which is the kind of Olivier Award-winning street dance company. Brought him in, and so created an experience that was kind of fusing classical text and street dance and live DJing and just like specific staging. And the moment I realised I had a career, or that I had arrived, was on the penultimate night. And, you know, we had huge school groups. They're not huge. I mean, we could only fit about 100 people into the space the way we'd set it up. But this particular night, the majority of the audience was a school group. And it was very exposing because it was all very open, and everyone was lit, the audience were lit, and everyone was present. So I always felt very fidgety when I was there and kind of really shy, like, oh God, all these people what do they think? And there were these kids there, and they were kind of really boisterous. And I sort of thought, well, they must be hating this. They must absolutely be hating this. And the piece ended with this kind of extraordinary bit of choreography that Kenrick created for my Medea, the brilliant Adura Onashile, who is now doing amazing work in Glasgow, actually. And this dance thing, where she kind of danced herself to death, essentially. And these 3 boys stood up and started stamping and cheering, and they were about 14, saying, "Go on, Medea." And I thought, are they taking the piss? Is this actually what? And they weren't. And I thought, okay, well, something's happened here. Something that tells me this is the space that I can create work in, which is looking at, and what my work has since gone on to explore, not solely, but one of the recurrent narratives in my work is looking at how do we tell epic stories with a really full embrace of the brilliance of kind of what people would categorise as diverse practice, which is, for me, things like street dance and pop and some of the tropes that I've used. Because for me, one of the big things is that our cultural vocabulary is shifting. And this idea of the well-made play is fine, and I love a well-made play as much as anybody, and I really hope I get to direct Private Lives someday and things like that. But you know, one of the really interesting things about now working in Leicester is that there is this thing that's, the Arts Council did this survey, the Active People Survey, judging, kind of assessing how many people were culturally engaged in the country. And Leicester apparently features in the kind of bottom 20% of engagement in the country. It is a cold spot. I've been here just over a year and I've had the good fortune to see and encounter so much creativity and so much talent. Most specifically in the field of dance, there's a huge dance tradition in this city around participatory dance, so break dancing and kind of South Asian classical and South Asian contemporary dance and things like that. And I guess the thing that I come back to is actually we're not in the bottom 20% of engagement. Actually, these kids and a lot of these people are just not engaging with what the Arts Council is funding and what is being defined by other people as what culture is. And I think that there is something potentially a little bit inappropriately paternalistic in that, because actually when I look at what I see young artists creating, when I look at certain kinds of street art and graffiti and often dance, I see excellence and extraordinary skill, and I think that is ignored. So that's kind of defined my work. So that kind of brings us to now, I guess.
So,
Yes.
so does the British South Asian term mean anything to you? Is it important?
It's important in the sense, it's important for me kind of in terms of the economics, I think. It's important for me in the sense of, there's a fact in this country, which is if you're from a minority background, you're often likely to be socially disenfranchised or have lower social capital. And it matters to me in the sense that I think that there is, there's alienation. So a lot of the stories that I explore, so in terms of my Medea, in terms of Othello, which I've also directed, these are stories about what happens to outsiders. And which are exploring an idea around who holds power and who is licensed to tell stories and things like that, and that really matters to me. So it's sort of, so I guess I've abstracted it in a way, so in the sense that I'm not, although I have, and I'm about to do so even more, looked at very specific what you may regard as specifically British Asian stories or South Asian stories. And that has been a recurrent theme in my career in terms of my work with new writers, specifically. I guess there's this overriding thing, which is about that outsider narrative and challenging those assumptions. Yeah.
So this you have a transnational identity in your background.
Yes, yeah.
And how has that kind of influenced you in your work?
Gosh, and I was thinking about this. I mean, one of the fundamental drivers of my work, I've realised, in terms of form and in terms of the things that matter to me, is that I grew up in a household where my mum watched Bollywood films all the time with no subtitles, and I wasn't being taught the language. And which gave me, and I, kind of Madhuri Dixit and well, Amitabh Bachchan and people like that, and Karishma Kapoor and these sorts of people who were kind of at that point where I was in that house and kind of seeing having all these videos and things coming through, was looking at this kind of really extraordinary archetypal storytelling, often using song and dance, but trying to figure out what the hell was going on and having to figure it out through physicality and through this idea of what a kind of shared language might be. I guess what that's given me as an artist, and this is maybe not engaging with your question in very political terms, but engaging with them in aesthetic terms, is my obsession with ideas of rhythm and space. I always work with a movement director on my work because I think that, you know, it is a cliche that, you know, 95% of communication is non-verbal, but that matters to me, how actually, so one of my, and you know, I've kind of picked up techniques over the years and that I've slotted into my approach and developed techniques and kind of stolen them from everywhere to give a very specific format of working. And one of the things that defines my working process is a kind of physicalized form of actioning, which is a very kind of Stanislavski kind of acting methodology, which is you kind of express everything as I am doing this to you and finding these verbs. And I think that's great, but it, you know, my thing with it was that I found it very academic, very in the head and not in the body. So I have created a process. I'm sure it's a process that a lot of other people use, so I'm not trying to say that this is my patented Schuber-Das directing technique, but I have this kind of physicalized action process where it's not only saying, you know, I do this to you and this is what I'm doing, but actually physicalizing it in as extraordinary and bold a way as possible. So if, you know, if the line is hello and the action is I throttle you, so the actors do this, and actually we literally create a choreography of the entire show, which we could play back, which I record, and which, you know, you could play back as a ballet if you wanted to, this kind of, and it's pushing all of that physicality to its biggest, largest possible form of expression. So then we then return to the language and take all of that away. So right now, let's just look at a scene. So they're in a kitchen, so they might just be talking to each other and seeing how that level of physical detail drives the momentum of the scene. And that is, you know, it can be quite a melodramatic process, but it's a process that is born from this thing of feeling that there is a physical rhythm that shapes language and that makes it accessible and makes it understandable. And to have directed by now a lot of Shakespeare, for example, and had bizarre episodes arise. I remember being in a lift at Rich Mix, actually, where my production of Macbeth was on, and young guy, you know, hoodie, was on the phone to a friend and was saying, yeah, I'm seeing this Macbeth. This was in the interval. And yeah, it's really weird because it's like half in modern English and half in Shakespeare, but it kind of works. And it was all Shakespeare. And I was kind of like, oh, it's a shame that you thought half was still Shakespeare. But it's that, and actually that because we embarked on that process and given it that real dynamic route through it, it suddenly made it open. And I think that is, and you know, sort of people like Pina Bausch have said it, that, you know, movement unifies and language divides. And I guess I think that's linked to that kind of transnational thing, certainly linked to kind of growing up in a household with a very fluid sense of what the dominant language was and what voices you were hearing and how you just figured out what was going on a day-to-day basis. And so I developed tools, and I now have the great fortune to use those tools in my work. So yeah, I think that's where it's encountered my practice.
So you're telling me about this exciting festival that you're putting together at the moment, and
yes,
you know, all your thoughts are going to come into the making of this, and there's going to be the artists and also the audiences. Be in Leicester, you know, there's I suppose huge South Asian audience. How are you going to connect all these?
Gosh, I'm trying to think what I'm allowed to say at this stage about the festival. I mean, I suppose in my role here and in the work that I create, both here and elsewhere, one of those linking things is looking at what stories are being told. I'm going to be very cryptic, I'm afraid, just because we've not kind of gone out there with our big announcements about the festival, certainly. But where, you know, we have the great fortune to have been able to take two plays that were originally created through a partnership between the Royal Court Theatre and Rage Theatre in Mumbai, and be staging those as a kind of centerpiece of the festival. And I guess what that opens up for me is this idea, and we're going to be staging them quite specifically with a community cast. One of the things that I did when I arrived here, I say, in terms of opening us up to that wider community, was a kind of it was almost a competition to find the 3 best participatory arts organisations in Leicester, embedded at that very grassroots level, and say, come here, use our spaces, use our resources. These things are open to you. So we now have an in-house breakdancing academy and an in-house Bollywood dance programme. We have an in-house gospel choir and all of these things. And that's really exciting. And it's sort of, and as I say, it's really interesting because actually these skills are not necessarily theatre-making skills. So it's now looking at how we take these people on that journey of now looking at whether their voice and their talent can be harnessed into creating theatre that reflects their practice and where they come from. So we'll be working with the Extraordinary Nupur Arts, who are a South Asian dance organisation who have created brilliant work for us here, but specifically looking at how they interact with these 2 plays, which are 2 plays looking at 21st century Asian experience in a very unusual and provocative way, because I think one of the big things is around complexity, and saying that there is complexity of perspective, and you know, there are stories that are, I feel, within Asian theatre told quite a lot. You know, there are a lot of plays around sort of, you know, arranged marriages, generational conflict, kind of, for whatever reason, because they're great, rich, dramatic sources of entertainment, of text, of ideas. What I don't necessarily see presented is work that is maybe exploring different political complexities, things like the role of women within society, both within India and what that means for that voice and that conversation here within the UK. There are things that I find really interesting. I find it really interesting that one of the most explosive, I think, accounts of minority perspective, and it was an incredibly challenging piece, and it was Deviates, Can We Talk About This? Which was not, you know, it had its flaws as a piece as well, and it had its limitations in terms of perspective. But I found it very interesting that they were a company telling that story, and where were the companies within our community telling that story, and why aren't these things being commissioned, and why aren't they moving through and emerging as stories within our community that we are choosing to tell and explore and confront. And I guess that's sort of part of what attracted me to a role in this city, and has, I guess, the transition in terms of my career. I've spoken a lot about classical work and creating work in that tradition, because, you know, these are texts that are available to you. They exist, they're great plays, and they're already there. And I reached a stage in my career where I can think about commissioning and think about finding stories and inviting people to create stories for me, and have the resources and the support to develop those fully and properly. And I guess what I'm really interested in is what stories can we tell that aren't being told, or that matter. You know, there are things that I'm really interested in at the moment. I'm really interested in the fact that I think there's got to be a link or something that can be drawn between, you know, the Delhi bus rape, and also the fact that we have this scenario where there have been these prostitution rings, and the press have made a great deal of the fact that they were run by Asian men, and there's something to explore there. And actually there's something to explore about the male identity within that, And, you know, there are plays popping up now which are quite importantly looking at the victim's voice within that. So, you know, there are a few plays that I've encountered over the last little while looking at the voice of a young girl who may have found herself within one of these prostitution rings and trying to address that. And in a way that's obviously an important perspective, but it's sort of the obvious one. And I guess one of the things that I'm really interested in that story is what is the perspective of that Asian man who is in this universe, and where does that come from, and what does that mean? And you kind of, you know, and I guess for somebody who's coming from looking at Medea and Othello, and an Othello which was very much seen through the lens of Iago, I'm very interested in the voices of the people who do the bad things, because they're the voices that we need to understand the most. It's kind of quite palliative, or kind of, it's almost sort of a sedative in a way, to kind of focus on the voice of the victim and the poor person who's wounded. And of course we should, but are we going to derive any kind of greater social understanding and really start pressing the buttons of what is dangerous, unless we spend some time really thinking about the voice of the people who we choose to regard as doing dreadful things. So I guess there is a link there, which I'd never even thought about until this very moment. So thank you for giving me that opportunity to articulate that connection. I don't know, I mean, I'm really aware that probably in terms of a lot of the people you're talking to, my perspective is a bit different. And what I wouldn't want anyone to take away from what I've just said is that I'm interested in focusing on all of the horrible things that are going on within kind of minority communities, because there are things to be celebrated, obviously. But I guess for me, I have always thought of theatre as a space where people who feel disconnected can feel integrated.
I think that's a great vision, really, and
Thank you.
I think it's going to be very successful, your festival.
Yeah, I mean, it's a start. You know, that's it, the festival next year is a start in terms of telling interesting stories and bringing a lot of wide-ranging creativity into an institution and a massive organisation, and really asserting that this is a space where people can be creative and can look at their stories. You know, one of the things that I'm proudest to have achieved in my time here thus far is establishing this Theatre's First Writers programme in a very small way, and that's something that we're also looking to expand. But it's just that sense of, again, who is telling stories, and the fact that it's a skill set, it's a toolkit, that's all it is, and actually we only learn by doing. And I'm lucky because, as I was saying earlier, I went to a school where I was allowed to do, and was even luckier to go to a state school where I was somehow they found support to allow kids to make, to try it for themselves, to take ownership of it. And then a university where that was kind of unquestioningly provided. So, you know, by this stage, really, I could say I've been directing for 16 years. So if I haven't figured out a little bit about it by now, then I'm clearly not, you know. But then there are a lot of people who come to it later, you know, and it's sort of how do we take them on a journey and share those skills with them, provide the safe space for them to be educated, trained, developed, nurtured, without doing the thing which I do think happens. I think it's really important to say that it happens, that people sometimes find themselves being showcased and spotlit before they're ready. Because we do operate in a society where there is, in a kind of cultural society, where there is an anxiety about the fact that there is a huge amount of subsidy, and yet the product doesn't necessarily reflect the diversity of the country. So of course, there is this sense, this embedded sense that we're constantly looking for who can our role models and artists be within that diverse world. And I've, without any shadow of a doubt, been subject to this and been subject to finding myself in moments, contexts, on panels and at meetings where I'm like, why the hell am I here? And I say that not in a kind of fishing for compliments way, but in the fact that I know personally that I've got a long journey still to go on in terms of my craft and my development. But I think it's very easy when you're kind of being put on that pedestal or being told, right, off you go, to kind of allow yourself to think that and think, yeah, well, I'm fine, I'm there. And actually, you know, we should look at the comparisons. We should look at the fact that because of background and education, a lot of our young BME directors you know, measure it. You know, I can measure the fact that I've done 16 years worth of directing, actually, by this point. Another BME director who's my age may have actually, because of their educational background, only done 5 years worth of directing. Of course, they're not going to be as accomplished in various things as I might be, because I've had just that bit more time. And unless we're upfront about that, I think we can run a real risk. And one of the real dangers that I think faces minority artists is not being candid about quality, not being candid about where people are in their development cycle. And because you get this latent thing then, which is insidious and really unhealthy and unhelpful, which is where these sort of gatekeepers kind of mutter to themselves in darkened rooms, they can't really do it. And you kind of go, whoa. And I've been in rooms where that's happened, and it's like, well, no, actually, that's not appropriate. The point is, they've not had as much exposure and training and development, and getting that right, that idea of how we're taking people through a coherent journey of development, is certainly something that's at the root of the festival that I'm trying to set up here. And a lot of the programmes and projects that I've put in place here are kind of around that, trying to grapple with that. Hopefully with some successes. I don't know. I'll find out. And I know that within that as well, there is another really problematic thing, which is that you then say, well, who are these people who are measuring that quality? And as I was talking about earlier, when they say, oh, you know, there's low cultural engagement, and I say, well, you're not counting these extraordinary breakdancers, and if that skill's being written off, you know. So there's this really problematic thing. It's a really problematic thing, which is that, you know, there are venues and institutions which are defined by an aesthetic which still revolves around the idea of the well-made play, and people's skill and talent is being measured against where they sit in relation to this idea of the well-made play. And I think there is a conversation about how we're training people from diverse backgrounds to make those well-made plays, but then there's a parallel conversation, which is, well, is the well-made play the thing that we should be aiming at? And I have no clue how anybody figures that problem out. And it's probably useless to just point it out. Anyone can point out that there's a kind of incoherence there. I think that's one of the challenges ahead.
Well, I wish you the best of luck for it. I think it's a great objective.
Thank you.